Finally, the third point I wanted to make in this regard is that evil actually proves God's existence. Yes, I think there's a good argument for God.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I have stumbled across this video where William Lane Craig, one of the world's most respected Christian apologists, is debating atheist philosopher Daniel Kame on the existence of God. And what you're about to see starting at the 47-minute mark is absolutely insane, because William Lane completely dismantles Daniel's entire probabilistic argument from evil by exposing a fundamental violation of probability theory. And then he does something even more brilliant. He flips the argument completely and shows how evil actually proves God exists instead of disproving him. So make sure you watch until the end, and please comment down below where you're watching from. I really love to see people from all over the world connecting in here. All right, now, let's get into the video.
Dr. Kame has not yet engaged any of my positive reasons to believe in God exists. And I would suggest that even if his arguments succeed in showing some improbability in God's existence, it's simply outweighed by the 5 arguments that I presented for God's existence. But do his arguments, in fact, show that it's improbable that God exists? Well, as I see it, he has 2 basic arguments. First, one from the hiddenness of God, and secondly, one from the evil in the world. With respect to divine hiddenness, I think it's important to understand that God's primary aim is to draw people into a saving love relationship with himself, not just to convince people that God exists. If that's all that God were interested in, then he could certainly have made his existence more obvious. For example, he could have written God exists in the stars, or planted a neon cross in the sky saying Jesus saves. But there's no guarantee at all that in such a world, this sort of display would draw more people into a saving love relationship with God. In fact, it might even have the opposite effect. After a while, people might begin to chafe under the brazen advertisements of their Creator and not to love him. The Bible says that God has provided sufficient evidence of his reality in nature and conscience, and by his Holy Spirit draws all persons to himself. As an omniscient being, he knows what would be most effective in drawing people freely into a saving love relationship with himself. What the atheist would have to prove is that a clearer revelation of God's existence would be more effective in drawing people freely into a saving love relationship than the way that God has in fact chosen, and that is pure speculation. Thus, there's simply no basis for thinking that divine hiddenness is an argument against God's existence. I might note as well that this really isn't an argument for atheism. It's an argument for universalism. It's to say that all persons should be saved. So even if you found the argument persuasive, it doesn't prove that God does not exist. It would just prove universalism is true. Well, what about then the problem of evil? Does evil disprove God's existence? Well, I think Dr. Kame admits that the logical version of the problem of evil is a failure. The atheist cannot prove that there is a logical incompatibility between the propositions God exists and evil exists. In order to show this, he would have to demonstrate that it is necessarily true that if God is all-powerful, he can create just any world that he wants, and if God is all good, then he would create a world without evil. And those propositions are not necessarily true. They lay a burden of proof on the atheist which no one has been able to sustain.
This is where William Lane Craig shows you why he's considered one of the sharpest philosophical minds in Christian apologetics. Because what he does here is completely dismantle the divine hiddenness argument, and he does it in a way that exposes the fundamental misunderstanding atheists have about what God is actually trying to accomplish. When William Lane says this, God's primary aim is to draw people into a saving love relationship with himself, not just to convince people that God exists. That is the key distinction that Daniel Daniel came completely misses. Because Daniel's entire argument assumes that if God exists, he would make his existence undeniable to everyone. But think about what that would actually produce. It wouldn't produce love. It wouldn't produce genuine relationship. It would produce compliance. And William Lane nails this when he points out he could have written God exists in the stars, or planted a neon cross in the sky saying Jesus saves. God could do that. He's omnipotent. But would that actually draw more people into authentic relationship with him? Or would it just create a world where people feel forced to acknowledge God while resenting his constant presence? That's the brilliance of this response, because real love requires freedom, and freedom means God has to leave space for doubt, for seeking, for genuine choice. Now here's what really matters about this whole divine hiddenness debate. The atheist is essentially demanding that God reveal himself in exactly the way they want, on their terms, with their timeline. But that's not how relationships work. That's not how love works. And the assumption that a loving God would immediately reveal himself to every sincere seeker completely ignores the possibility that God knows better than we do what would actually be most effective in drawing each individual person into relationship with him. Then William Lane moves to the problem of evil, and watch what happens. He says, the logical version of the problem of evil is a failure. And he's absolutely right about this. Even most atheist philosophers today admit that the logical problem of evil doesn't work anymore. Why? Because you cannot prove that God and evil are logically incompatible. You'd have to demonstrate that it's necessarily true that an all-powerful God can create any world he wants, and that an all-good God would create a world without evil. And nobody has been able to prove those are necessarily true. William Lane even cites Peter Van Inwagen, saying, it used to be held that evil was incompatible with the existence of God. Used to be, past tense. Because philosophers across the board, theist and atheist, recognize that argument is dead. So the atheist had to shift to a probabilistic argument instead. They can't prove logical incompatibility, so now they're trying to argue that evil makes God improbable. And that's what William Lane is about to destroy in the next section.
In fact, as long as it's even possible that God would have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world, then it's possible that God and the evil in the world coexist. And so for this reason, the logical version of the problem of evil has been widely recognized by theist and atheist alike as bankrupt. Peter Van Inwagen, a prominent Christian philosopher, says it used to be held that evil was incompatible with the existence of God, that no possible world contained both God and evil. So far as I am able to tell, this thesis is no longer defended. So the question then is, does the evil in the world render God's existence improbable, if not impossible? Well, here I will simply defend the view that Dr. Kame already sketched, that given our cognitive limitations, we are simply not in a position to say with any sort of confidence, when some incidence of evil occurs, that God probably doesn't have a morally sufficient reason for permitting this. William Alston, in his article in Philosophical Perspectives, lists 6 such cognitive limitations which make it in principle impossible for us to make these kinds of probabilistic judgments. He says it is in principle impossible for us to be justified in supposing that God does not have sufficient reasons for permitting evil that are unknown to us. Take, for example, the illustration of the historical ripple effect. God's morally sufficient reason for permitting some evil to enter your life might not emerge until centuries from now, maybe in another country. When you think about the control of a provident God over the whole of human history, who sees the end from the beginning, you can see how hopeless it is for us finite, historically limited observers to speculate upon whether or not God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting some incident of suffering to enter our lives. So Alston says the judgments required by the probabilistic version of the problem of evil are of a very special and extraordinarily ambitious type, and our cognitive capacities are not equal to this one. We are simply not in a position to justifiably assert that God would have no sufficient reason for permitting evil. And if that is right, he says, the probabilistic argument from evil is in no better shape than the late lamented logical argument from evil. Now, Dr. Kane has a very interesting response to this consideration in his opening speech. He points out that there are 4 different possibilities that an event might have through the ripple effect it sends through history. It could make the evil worse, it could be morally neutral, it could have an outweighing good. Now, he concludes from that therefore the probability of its having an outweighing good is only 1/4. That's logically fallacious. That argument violates probability theory. Consider a bag of marbles, and you don't know the color of the marbles in the bag. You might think, well, if I pick a marble from the bag, there's a 50% chance that it's red and a 50% chance it's not red. And so the chance of picking a red marble are 50%. Well, that's obviously fallacious because it could be blue marbles in the bag or green marbles in the bag. You simply cannot make any sort of probability estimate based upon that kind of blind calculation.
This is where William Lane Craig absolutely demolishes Daniel Camera's entire probabilistic argument from evil. And I mean demolishes it. Because what Daniel tried to do was assign mathematical probabilities to whether suffering leads to greater good or greater evil. And William Lane exposes why that's complete philosophical nonsense. Here's what William Lane establishes first. He says, it is in principle impossible for us to be justified in supposing that God does not have sufficient reasons for permitting evil. In principle, impossible. Not just difficult, not just unlikely, impossible. And why? Because of our cognitive limitations as finite beings trying to judge the decisions of an infinite, all-knowing God who sees the entire timeline of history from beginning to end. Think about what William Lane is arguing here. When something bad happens in your life, you're experiencing that moment from your limited perspective. You see the pain, you see the suffering, you see the immediate consequences, but you have no idea what ripple effects that event will have 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. You don't know if that suffering will lead someone to make a different choice that saves lives. You don't know if that hardship will develop character that changes the world. You're not omniscient. You can't see the full picture. And here's where it gets devastating for Daniel's argument. Because Daniel tried to calculate probabilities. He said, okay, if we can't know the ripple effects, then there are 4 possibilities. The event leads to greater good, leads to some good but not enough, leads to more evil, or is morally neutral. And Daniel concluded, well, if we don't know which one it is, then there's only a 25% chance it leads to greater good. So probably God doesn't exist. And William Lane just shreds this logic. He says that's logically fallacious, that argument violates probability theory. Then he gives the marble analogy. He says that's obviously fallacious because it could be blue marbles in the bag or green marbles. You see what he's doing? He's showing that you can't just assign equal probabilities to different possibilities when you have no information. That's not how probability works. If I have a bag of marbles and I don't know what colors are inside, I can't just say, well, there's a 50% chance of red and 50% chance of not red. Therefore, the probability of red is 50%. That's absurd because the bag could have 0 red marbles. The bag could have all blue marbles. The bag could have 10 different colors. You cannot make probability estimates when you're working in complete ignorance of the actual distribution. And William Lane drives this home when he says, you simply cannot make any sort of probability estimate based upon that kind of blind calculation. That is the fatal flaw in the probabilistic argument from evil. The atheist is pretending to know. Probability distributions that are fundamentally unknowable to finite human minds. They're pretending they can calculate the likelihood that an omniscient God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting suffering, but they don't have access to the information needed to make that calculation. calculation. It's mathematical theater. It looks sophisticated, but it's built on a foundation of ignorance.
Similarly here, there's no reason to think that the probability of the outweighing good is 1/4 or 25%. And this is particularly true if the world is under the providential control of an omnipotent and loving God who orders the universe so that evils have outweighing goods. It's not a matter of random chance. The hypothesis of theism is that God is in control of human history and so orders the world so that he has morally sufficient reasons for the evils that occur. So when we see an incident of evil in our lives, we have no idea of what its impact will be upon the world. Those probabilities are simply inscrutable, and therefore you cannot say either way whether that evil has an outweighing good or makes things worse. And if that's the case, then the atheist argument from evil fails. Because remember, he has the burden of proof to show that it is improbable that God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting that evil. And he's not been able to shoulder that burden of proof. He's making probability judgments that are way beyond our capacity to make with any confidence. Finally, the third point I wanted to make in this regard is that evil actually proves God's existence. Yes, I think there's a good argument for God from evil. It goes like this. Premise one, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. 2, evil exists. 3, therefore, objective moral values exist. Some things are evil, therefore God exists. So while on a superficial level, evil might seem to call into question God's existence, on a deeper philosophical level, evil actually proves God's existence because in the absence of God, nothing would be good or evil as such. And therefore, I'm not persuaded that the arguments from the evil in the world are at all compelling. Evil in the world is not logically incompatible with God's existence, and we're not in any position to say with any sort of confidence that the evils in the world are improbable with respect to God's existence. When we consider then the good arguments that we do have for God's existence, I think it becomes quite probable that God does exist, and that therefore theism remains the more plausible and probable worldview.
What William Lane does in this final section is one of the most brilliant philosophical moves in apologetics, because not only does he show why the argument from evil fails, he then completely flips the argument and shows how evil actually proves God exists. And when you understand this, it changes everything. Listen to what he establishes. He says, those probabilities are simply inscrutable, and therefore you cannot say, either way, whether that evil has an outweighing good or makes things worse. Inscrutable, unknowable. And this is especially true if we're operating under the hypothesis that God exists. Because if an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God exists and has providential control over history, then the probability that evils lead to greater goods is not random. It's not a matter of chance. God would be actively ordering reality so that suffering serves redemptive purposes. So the atheist's probability calculations completely fall apart. But here's where it gets really interesting. William Lane says, evil actually proves God's existence. Yes, I think there's a good argument for God from evil. Wait, what? How does evil prove God exists? Because of objective moral values. And this is where most people miss the deeper philosophical point. The atheist stands up and says, look at all this evil in the world, therefore God doesn't exist. But wait a second. When you call something evil, you're making an objective moral judgment. You're saying this isn't just something you personally dislike. You're saying it's actually objectively wrong. It violates some moral standard that exists independent of human opinion. But where does that objective moral standard come from on atheism? William Lane lays out the syllogism. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. 2, evil exists. 3, therefore objective moral values exist. Some things are evil, therefore God exists. This is brilliant brilliant, because the atheist needs objective moral evil to exist in order to make the argument from evil work. But objective moral values can't exist without God. So by appealing to evil, the atheist is actually presupposing the existence of God. Think about it this way. If we're just the product of blind evolutionary processes, if we're just matter in motion following the laws of physics, then what we call good and evil are really just subjective preferences shaped by evolution and social conditioning. There's nothing objectively wrong with anything. It's all just molecules bumping into other molecules. The universe doesn't care. Nature doesn't have moral properties. A lion killing a gazelle isn't evil. A supernova destroying a planet isn't evil. These are just natural events. But when the atheist says, "Look at this child suffering from disease," that's evil and proves God doesn't exist. They're smuggling in a concept that their worldview can't account for. They're assuming there's an objective moral standard being violated, but that standard requires a transcendent moral lawgiver. It requires God. So William Lane shows that the argument from evil is actually self-defeating for the atheist, because in order to call something evil, you need objective morality. But objective morality requires God. So evil doesn't disprove God. Evil actually points us toward God as the only coherent foundation for moral truth. And William Lane concludes, theism remains the more plausible and probable worldview, because theism can account for both the existence of evil and our recognition that evil is objectively wrong. Atheism can't account for either. This is why philosophical theology matters, because these aren't just abstract debates. These are questions about whether reality has moral meaning, whether suffering has purpose, whether there is an objective foundation for calling anything truly good or truly evil. And William Lane Craig demonstrates here why the Christian worldview provides the most coherent answers to those fundamental questions about human existence. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.